Hey everyone, Matt Thomas here. Thanks for watching. So this is the Science of Reading video, and I will tell you it's my third time recording this. The first time, it was great. It was just an hour and a half long. And so I thought no one is going to want to hear me talk about the science of reading for an hour and a half. And so I decided to re-record it and maybe, cut out some of my extended commentary and not use so many analogies. If you've seen my videos in the past, you know that I really like using analogies. And so the second time I recorded it, I got it down to about an hour, but the recording software I used stopped working halfway through, and I'm like, no. So I decided to re-record this in smaller segments and just edit this together. So if you're watching this video and you hear like a voice break, I just edited parts together. Not that any of you would have known if I didn't tell you. So thank you so much for watching this. This is still, like I said, it's going to still be about an hour video. It's going to be filled with very important, very powerful information. And thank you for sticking with me. So I want to talk about why I think this information is so important and kind of my intent with this research and with this video. Historically, reading has been so difficult for people, right? There's been, especially in education, there's been a major focus on developing great readers or better readers, raising our students' reading test scores for many, many years. And the difficulty of reading has been going on for many generations. And so if something has historically been difficult for humans to do, there's got to be a reason for it. Right? That's my thinking when going into this. And there absolutely is a reason for it. And so this video is going to hopefully answer all of your questions behind the science of reading and all the other questions that go along with that. And it's important for teachers to know this because teachers are heavily impacted by their students' reading test scores. Right? If a teacher's students aren't where he or she thinks they should be, there could be some self-doubt. The teacher could be like, am I an effective teacher, right? Because my students' reading scores aren't as high as they should be or where I want them to be. Without knowing all the information behind why reading scores really are where they are or how the brain develops reading, etc. And so that's what that's the goal of this video, is to explain everything involving the science behind reading and why reading test scores are where they are and why it's so difficult. Hopefully by the end of this workshop, you'll be able to teach your own reading workshop on the science of reading. And before we get into the science and all the information, I will ask, please, as you're watching this video, presuming that most people are watching this are educators or parents, please be open-minded of the information that you hear, the information that I present. Please do be open-minded, because what I found through all of this research is there's a lot of different perspectives on how reading should be taught, and the so-called reading wars. And oftentimes, I've also found that people will pick and choose the science, the research that supports their perspective, their belief. So please, as you are watching this video, please be very open-minded, because as educators, I'm going to tell you things that we haven't heard before. Education doesn't necessarily focus on. And I think oftentimes I'll just tell you this. In neuroscience, right? Neuroscience will explain how the brain learns. Education focuses on the art of teaching, right? Well, sometimes we don't talk, and I wish we would talk more often. But to be fair, neuroscientists will tell educators, hey, you should do this, you should focus up more on this. But neuroscientists haven't always been in the classroom, like high school, middle school, elementary school classroom. Educators have been, but they might not have the actual information on how the brain learns, right? So the reality is, the realistic approach to reading kind of is somewhere in the middle. You'll see as I lay out all this information. So please be open-minded to this information as I'm sharing this with you. There are very clear-cut answers to most likely all of the questions you have. How those are implemented, there's many effective ways to do that. So it'll all be explained as the video goes on. Again, thank you so much for watching. So I want to talk about the different meanings of science, or different meanings of the term science. And I think this is very important, because when you get into the research realm, if you will, you're going to see a lot of different terms based on science, science-based, etc., research-driven, all that stuff. And after doing all this research and all the research I've done for different professional development workshops and videos, I've started to realize that those terms that include the word science aren't always the same. They don't always have the same meaning. And I think it's important for us as educators to be able to kind of understand what those different terms can mean, so that when we're evaluating a text or a workbook or a textbook or something, or educational strategy or a method of teaching, we can kind of see like how they're defining those terms when they say supported by science, research-based, etc. Because if someone's trying to sell a textbook or a method of instruction, oftentimes they'll include that term, backed by research, science-based, etc. And I have on the screen some terms you're going to see: based on science, science-based, science-driven, research-based, scientifically supported, backed by research, scientific approach, evidence-based. And if someone's trying to make an argument and they include one of these phrases, it tends to seem to lend credibility to that argument, whether it does or doesn't. But it just tends to seem to lend credibility. And it's not at times maybe that they're wrong, but they may be misleading or inaccurate. I always joke, like if someone says, well, according to research, blah, 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 and then it kind of seems like their argument is credible, whether it is or isn't. And so when in the structure of say evaluating how to teach reading, there are multiple different perspectives of how to teach reading. And they all have their scientific research, and they all say, my perspective of teaching reading, my method of teaching reading is the best because it's based on science. And again, it's not that they're wrong. It just may be inaccurate depending on how they're defining science. So I think it's important for us to know. A perfect example would be, I was evaluating a method of teaching just the other day, and in their philosophy of teaching and their methods and their instructions, there's one part where they would, after students learn a new vocab word and use that in a sentence, they turn to their partner and repeat that sentence 3 times. And so technically, for a person to remember something, right, it needs to be repeated. Like that's true. It needs, now if you just learn something and repeat it, the brain will hold on to it for a little while. But if it's not, repeated multiple times, put in context that the brain will remember, rooted in something the student already knows, if the brain doesn't see it as important, it's going to repurpose those cells and kind of delete the information. Oftentimes, that's what happens when learning a new vocab word. But technically, they're not wrong. If to learn a new vocab word, it needs to be repeated. So that part, technically, you could argue is scientifically driven, is based on science. The thing is, though, when evaluating that teaching method, it was the textbook, the feedback that I hear from teachers and from students is that the whole curriculum is very dry, really dull. The students don't enjoy it, and the teachers don't enjoy teaching it. And so, you could argue curiosity, enjoyment with achievement is a much more impactful, has much more of an impact on whether we learn something or not, more so than just repeating something, a few times. So technically, are both based on science? Yes, but curiosity, enjoyment with achievement, enjoying what you're doing, having fun learning, you could argue is much more impactful. Not just argue, it is much more impactful than just repeating something, though they are both based on science. So I want to, make sure that's clear. And science teachers, I'm going to do my best to say this. I hope I'm saying it accurately. For something to be based on scientific research, essentially, it's having predetermined factors, parameters, and repeatable steps to form an outcome, to get data. So as long as is in the experiment, the steps are predetermined and they're repeatable every time, then you should get data. But as we know, it's not always the data that we get, but how we interpret the data. So what if the parameters are flawed or inaccurate? Or what if the person evaluating or interpreting the data is interpreting it inaccurately? They could slap that label based on science, but they may be interpreting the science or the data incorrectly. So just keep that in mind when evaluating a person's argument, a textbook, a perspective, a philosophy of teaching and education method. Just because it says research-based, based on science, evidence-based, then it doesn't mean It doesn't mean they're wrong, but it could be a little misleading or inaccurate there. And again, you'll see terms based on science, science-based, science-driven, research-based, scientifically supported, backed by research, scientific approach, evidence-based, according to research. You'll see those terms. We just have to now kind of try to interpret how they're saying that, the meaning behind what they're saying. Down below, I do have a video link, micro versus macro research. It's a video I did a couple years ago about how when we can evaluate research on a micro level, meaning just if it's something that was effective for a person's classroom or school or district or region, it could be influenced by the demographics of the region, the perspective of the people doing it, the motivation and the philosophies of the administration at the time. That's more micro. When I try to evaluate teaching lessons or method of educations, teaching philosophies, I look at a macro research, meaning large scale, not large scale in terms of numbers of amount of people in there, if it's localized region, but across the world. So if a teaching strategy works in Southern California based on macro research, it should also work the same in Finland, in China, in Topeka, Kansas, all over, if it's based on how the brain learns, which brain development tends to be very consistent unless there's a developmental issue, all throughout the world on a macro level. So it's a great video to watch. Okay, before we get to the information, right? Because you're like, Matt, just tell us, like, what's the best way to teach reading? So there is a lot of information, and I had to try to figure out when making this video, like, how much do I share? What do I share? And before you go, all of it, like, it would be a 4-hour video. I'm not exaggerating, because there's a lot out there. And so I had to figure out, like how in depth do I go with this, right? Do I talk about the angular gyrus and the importance and impact it would have on comprehension with what do I go into? Because there's tons of support for many reading strategies, right? Because you hear there's this term, the reading wars, right? This perspective says that theirs is the best way to teach reading, and they've got the science to support that. And this perspective says that theirs is the best way to teach reading. They've got the research to support the science. And we talked about, when looking at the term science, how they're, depicting that or interpreting that, et cetera. And so there's and I will tell you, there's a lot of support for many strategies. There really is. Just depends on, what support or what research or what science you think is truly effective. So, and how they interpret the data. So what I did was, and I think this is fair, I kind of looked at it as power standards. So that this is not a 4-hour video and not going into all the technicalities, because there's tons of stuff. And it does relate somehow. I looked at it like power standards. Do you guys remember the power standards from 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, where it's like, hey, we have all these standards and we don't have the time for our students to master everything. So let's look at the main power standards and let's focus on that. And I'm making this number up. So don't quote me saying this. I'm making this number up. That's like maybe the top 80%. Like if they master the power standards, that's most of the stuff. And then the rest can kind of fall in. And so that's how I treated this when trying to okay, what information do I present and how in depth do I go with this? What's most relevant? What's most important for us, right? What's the most important, powerful standards, the main stuff? I looked at that way. Like the stuff presented in here, we'll get probably the top 80% of the information you'll ever need to know. The rest, is the little tiny other stuff that, though relevant, may not be as impactful as what I'm presenting here. So I pretty much am presenting the information I feel is the most important in building a foundation for an understanding on reading, on the holistic aspect of reading. So as I was doing this research and looking at all the data, when someone asks the question, like, what is the best way to teach reading? Because that's what we want to know, right? What's the best way to teach reading? But I was realizing there's so many other questions. Right? There's so many different questions to ask that each require different answers. So is the answer that a person wants, what is the best way to teach reading? Some of you are yelling, yeah. You'll get that. I'll explain that. I'll share that. But I have to say that it's, depending on what you're reading for. So there's many other questions. The questions may be like, not just what's the best way to teach reading, but how do people learn to read? Right? We need to understand that. What is the best reading strategy for that particular level? Because you'll see what's the best way to teach reading versus how is reading learned in the brain can be different. Can also be the same. It depends. But the question may be like, how do we raise our students' test scores? Right? Like, what the best way to teach reading and how do we raise our students' test scores is a different question. And, what's the most effective way to learn? Well, curiosity is it. That's, you got to spark curiosity to get our students to want to learn. But then the question is, what's the most effective way to create curiosity? Because what's the best way to teach reading and what's the best way to get them to want to read are two different questions that are two different answers. Or could be the same, depending on your perspective of it. How do we get our students to enjoy reading, right? And so the question might not be, how do I get my students to read? Because they are reading. They are reading text. They are reading social media. Our students are reading. But the question may be rather like, how do I get them to read what I want them to read and analyze that and apply that? How do I do that? Like, that might be the best question. And how do I get them engaged in my reading? So I want them to read what how do I get them to read what I want? How do I get them to analyze it, to apply it, to engage it? That's a different question than what's the best way to teach reading. So holistically, all of this information, I'll do my best to answer as many of those as possible. So they are different questions that do require different answers. So let's start looking at the data. And before we get into the science of reading, I want to talk about the reality of reading as an adult. So these are numbers. I have links for all of these, and you can click those and read where I got all this information from. Here's the reality of reading as an adult. 1 in 5 adults are illiterate. Only 12% of adults are proficient readers. So 20% of all adults out there are illiterate. And only 12% of adults are proficient readers. So again, this just shows how difficult reading can be. Learning to read, reading, developing reading can be. Only 31% of college graduates read at a proficient level. Now, to be fair, this study was from 2003. I have not been able to find an updated study on this, but I would say fairly confidently, based on all the research I'm going to show you, that I don't think the numbers would be too far off now, relating to 2003. I wouldn't say the numbers will be too far off about that. So only 31% of college graduates read at proficient level. And I think sometimes as educators, I think it's fair if I want to say that many teachers, because our job is education, I would say many teachers are good readers. I think that's fair to say. I wouldn't go as far as saying most because of the numbers we're looking at and all the research coming. I would say the reality is many teachers are good readers. So we might have a skewed perspective on like what we think, what reading level we think people should be at, or we might have a skewed perspective on reading and how easy it is to develop. And it's very, very difficult. And you look at these numbers here, and again, only 1/3 of all college graduates read at a proficient level, which may make you start questioning the definitions of the levels. Like, maybe the levels are, the definition of levels are inaccurate. We're going to talk about that actually later on, how these levels are defined. 54% of all adults read at a 6th grade level or below. I'm going to say that again. 54% of all adults out there read at a 6th grade level or below. Or you could look at it the other way. Only 46% of all adults read above a 6th grade level. So that's very powerful to show just how difficult reading is. I do want to make a comment. I'm going to bring this up later in the video, but I don't want to forget, so I'm going to make the comment now. Going back to 31% of all college graduates read at proficient level, and only 46% read above 7th grade level or so. There's the thought sometimes that a student needs to be at a certain level of reading. I'm not going to say reading level, but level of reading to do a certain job. So like as a doctor, doctors need to read at this level because of how difficult the medical terminology is, et cetera, et cetera. And so I would never deter a student from following or pursuing their passion, what they want to do, based on a certain reading level, knowing that the program that they're in can bring them up to that reading level. So if a person wants to be a doctor, and let's say you have a student that wants to be a doctor, that their reading level isn't necessarily where it needs to be a doctor, the years of training, the years of learning that medical vocabulary can bring that student up to that level. So I would be very cautious as a teacher to not deter students from following their passion, following their dream, just because of a reading level that they're at. Because their level of reading can be, enhanced by the program that they're in. I think of the neuroscience, in general. If someone wants to be a neuroscientist, but they don't have all the knowledge of the neuroscience terms, through the years of education, it can bring them up to that. So I just had the side commentary. I'll mention that a little bit later on too. And so these numbers really just bring up that difficulty reading is not just a teenage or an ELD thing. Developing reading is difficult for adults. And you just look at the numbers there and how truly difficult it is. All right, so I'm about to answer the question, why is reading so difficult? And you're like, thank you, Matt. It's about time. So if all you want to know is why reading is so difficult, here's the answer. The reason reading is so difficult is that humans are not born with the ability to read, nor are we born with the neural circuitry to read. There is no part of our brain that specializes in reading. There is no part of our brain that is created at birth, that is there when we're born, that specializes in reading. It does not exist. The fact that we can read in the first place, many neuroscientists call a miracle. So, I've got the quote there, we're not born to read, it's an invention. So if you just want to know why reading is so difficult, always go back to that. We are not born with the ability to read, nor do we have the neural circuitry to read. It's not there. And don't worry, I will explain how it gets developed, and I will explain this hopefully, probably multiple times. But I need to be careful not to explain it too much because I don't want to overkill it and bore you guys to death. But always remember this. Why is it so difficult to read? Why are our students at different reading levels? Why are 1 in 5 adults illiterate? Why do only 31% of all college graduates proficient readers? It's because we're not born with the ability to read, nor do we have that part of our brain there. There's no neural circuitry to read. I'll explain how it gets developed, but it's not there. So always go back to this. Always go back to this. That we're just not born with that ability. And always keep that in mind when looking at how best to teach reading, though we talked about that's not always the accurate question we want to ask, or that's not always the question we want to answer. We looked at that in a previous slide. But always remember it. If you're just wondering why reading is so difficult, you don't ever have to question why it is. We know why. Humans are not born with that ability, nor do we have the neural circuitry to read. It's created. It's an invention. And it's created through processes that are so important for parents to develop. And as teachers, right, when parents pass their children off to us to educate them in reading, a lot of how easy it is for us to educate, for educators to develop reading, is based on what the parents have already established. And we'll look into that when we look into the environmental aspect, emotional aspect of reading. So, why is reading so difficult? Boom, that's the answer. We're not born with the ability to read. There's no neural circuitry to read. And I'll explain right now how it gets developed. All right, so how do we develop the ability to read? So I've got like 3, maybe 4 slides on this. Apparently I felt it very important to hammer down this information and to make sure that you knew this. I'll try not to repeat so much because I think that all the slides pretty much say the same thing. But how do we develop the ability to read? So I want to just reiterate that, when we're questioning how difficult it is to read and when we see our students at different reading levels, we have to understand that we're not born with that ability. So we have to always keep that in mind. But how do we develop the ability to read? So I linked an article by Dr. DeHaan. He's essentially the foremost authority figure on this. He spent his life research doing this, how the brain learns, the ability to learn how to read, et cetera, et cetera. And so a lot of these links will be articles and videos based on his research. So essentially, we're born with an established system for language and vision. Unless there's a developmental issue, we're born with a very well established system for vision and a very well established system for language. We're born with the ability to speak, right? So, we're born and we start screaming right away. We're trying to communicate, right, through language. We're born with a well-established system for vision. And so vision and language, we're not born with anything developed for reading. So a network has to be created for reading to happen between vision, we have to see letters, and language, we have to put sounds to those letters. And then we have to start creating meaning of those sounds and words, etc., that comes along. So we end up recycling pre-existing circuits to link between our visual pathway and our language area. So I'm going to say that again. We are born with an established system for vision, we can see. We are born with an established system for language, right? We're born with that in our brain, unless, of course, there's a developmental issue. A network has to be created between those two systems, literally created, for reading to occur. And essentially, the language area and the vision area have a baby. Kinda. Right? We're recycling circuits that were pre-existing, that are used between language and vision together and creating a whole new network, a whole new area. And the fascinating thing is, if that wasn't fascinating enough, it has to be built for every child every time. So it's not like we evolved to learn to read. 5,000 years ago, this wasn't happening. We didn't evolve and then slowly over time, now we're born, with this ability. Not at all. It literally has to be created in each child every single time a baby's born. It starts all over and creates this. And so much of how well a person's reading ability is developed and established is based on what the parents do. You'll see in the research. Based on what parents do when the child's in the womb and when the child's born, and after that, and in the household, and how they communicate with the child, so much of how much their reading level is established is based on that. And that third network is called the visual word form area. So visual, seeing our letters, language, putting that sound to those letters, creating words. So essentially, if you look here, I've got another link. This is a video really explaining that in detail. What happens is the brain then, once we have the link between the visual network and the language network, the occipital lobe, which is in the back of the head, right? That's where our vision comes from. And it's kind of like when you get hit in the back of the head, you see stars. That's where our visual network is. So we see lines on a page. We start recognizing those as letters. We take those letters, place sounds to those letters, and then connect those letters and combine them into words. So essentially, we're connect to the system's coding for speech, sound, and meaning. So the sounds that the letters make, and then being able to interpret those sounds into meaning. Got the picture there of where the processing starts. And that visual word form area, or what's called now the brain's letterbox, has to be created before effective reading can occur. Again, another link to another video. Feel free to watch that. I will probably be repeating some information here. I want to make sure I don't leave anything out. But with the whole process, our brain recycles circuits that recognizes objects and faces and turns them into circuits that recognize letters. So we have to establish the alphabet, right? We have to establish what the alphabet is, what each letter is, and what sound that letter makes. Our brains connect those circuits to the circuits used for spoken language. So we're born with that ability to speak out and to yell. And then essentially we're converting visual letters to recognizable sounds. Once that conversion happens, we can focus on the meaning of a word. The stronger the language pathway, the stronger language is developed, the easier it'll be for the brain to reuse some of those cells to create a strong reading network. And so what happens in reading, the way reading is established, is the brain will process every letter. And this continues on through, as we continue to read and develop reading. The brain processes every letter. But skilled readers convert convert visual letters to sound, to meaning very, very quickly. Not how, like you'll hear like whole words, sight words, you'll hear that perspective of reading. The brain, the way reading is established in the brain is that the brain sees the letter, figures out what sound that is, and converts it to word meaning very, very rapidly. The brain doesn't learn reading based on sight words or whole words. And as effective readers, the better we are we get at reading. And of course, if you're an effective reader, you do that just very, very quickly. So, again, one more slide here. It's got another link to a video. And I've already said this. Essentially, the letters, the brain sees the letters, connects sounds to those letters, recognizes letters and how they combine in written words, and connect systems coding for speech and sound meaning. I think I already wrote that elsewhere as well. So knowing that we are not born with any area of our brain to read, and knowing that it has to be developed individually for each child, and knowing how important it is for us to be able to see the letters, first to be able to understand the language and the sounds that those letters make, and then we can connect those into words and make meaning out of it. Knowing how difficult that is and how the brain has to create that, imagine that. So you have the students in your class all have different developed levels of reading circuitry. So you've got 36 students in your class, right? Each of them went through their own individual childhood, and you're going to see how important the environmental and emotional aspect of reading is to develop reading. You're going to see just how important that is as I continue in the research. So imagine this. You're in a classroom. You got 36 different students. Each one had different parent involvement to establish this reading network, to create this reading circuitry. Each one has their own history and exposure to reading, to looking at alphabets, to hearing language development. Each one has their own different level. So you now have 36 different students at different levels of their neural network or their reading network created. So when you're like, dude, I have so many different ranges of reading levels in my classroom. Yeah, now you know why. So let's use this scenario. Let's say you're in a parent-teacher conference and, Johnny's mom is like, hey, my son isn't reading well. Why isn't my son reading well at all? A very valid and real response would be that your son isn't reading well because the circuitry between his language system and his visual system hasn't been developed yet. That's a very real response. Now, I don't know how the parent's going to take that, but that's it. There's your answer. That reading network has not been established very well yet. And I included a link here to an article, Why Johnny Can't Read. This was published back in 1955, and essentially it was a scientist going, what's my son or daughter, the son or daughter can't read very well, how is reading being taught, etc. And then he went and looked at it, he was a scientist, and went, oh my gosh. So I bring that up because the reading issue has been going on for generations. Just this article alone's 80 years old. And so it's not like our students can't read well. It's not like that's a new thing. This has been going on for many, many, many generations. And that's really that kind of why do our students read at different levels? Well, they all have different levels of reading networks developed. So now that we looked at how difficult reading is and how difficult it is as an adult to establish a proficient level of reading, and how the brain has to create this network, this reading network from scratch, let's look at the best way to teach reading. And the answer to the question, what is the best way to teach reading, is not so cut and dry. And essentially, it takes a village. And if you look at the screen here, you see the slide. I've got the three aspects of reading, the three perspectives, the three educational philosophies, however you want to refer to them. And each of them have their own, perspective on their science research, right? Each of these three will say, my perspective is based on science. And we talked about that earlier, how to evaluate that. So the first one is neuroscience, right? The first philosophy or perspective or aspect of reading, how to develop reading, is neuroscience, right? How the reading is created or established in the brain, that reading network. Then there's behavioral psychology, emotional, environmental aspect of how to facilitate successful reading, how to establish that. And then there's whole words, sight words, balanced literacy, context clues, those as well, that category. And each will say, hey, look, we've got the research, this way is more important than another way, et cetera, et cetera. So let's look at all three of these different aspects or, educational philosophies, elements of reading development individually. So the first one is neuroscience. And there's the whole, there's this term reading wars, trying to, find what's the best way to teach reading. And we've already established why reading is so difficult. And we always have to remember that. We are trying to find out what the best way to teach something, reading, for something that is not naturally developed, right? So that's going to be a challenge in and of itself. But let's look at the three perspectives, the three aspects. First is neuroscience. So neuroscientists will say there is no reading war. And neuroscientists agree educators need to come on board with this. So that's a quote, and I wish I remembered where I got that from. It's an exact quote. I always try to link quotes. I don't know where I got that from, so sorry, guys. But that's a quote. Someone said it. A neuroscientist said it. But there is no reading war, right? This is how the brain learns to read. And so to answer the question, how do we teach reading based on how reading is developed in the brain? It's phonemes and graphemes. There's anyone who suggests otherwise doesn't have a complete understanding on how the brain learns to read. I think that's fair to say. And so I won't go into the definitions of all these terms. I'm presuming if you're watching this, you're probably a teacher. You probably have some experience in phonemes and graphemes. Essentially, it's establishing the individual sounds of the letters and then the visual representation of those, etc. And so the way that our brain establishes reading is to see the letters with our language, create meaning, connect a sound to those individual letters, and then put them all together and create meaning of those words. And so I'll read a few things off the list here just so I'm not leaving anything out. But our brain sees the letters and connects sounds to the words. They recognize the letters and how they combine into written words and connect the system's coding for speech, sounds, and meaning. I've already said that before. And so essentially teaching explicit correspondence between letters and sounds, graphemes and phonemes, is how to teach the circuits going directly from vision to spoken language. Shaywitz says in 2003 article, he wrote, children who obtain phonemic awareness, which is the ability to hear and manipulate sounds, before entering school are likely to succeed in reading. And then Stanovich, 1998 article, said that many students with reading disabilities, it's because they're poor phonemic awareness skills. So how do we create reading in the brain? How do we create that foundation? How is reading learned in the brain? Phonemes, graphemes. There it is, based on neuroscience. So I have a link here to the studies. The National Reading Panel in 2000 did a meta-analysis study, huge study, and looked at effective reading strategies or effective strategies to teach reading. Now, let's be fair. This research has not been updated. This was from the year 2000, has not been updated, was connected to No Child Left Behind. So, take it for what it's worth, right? Take it for however you'd like. But they did find, quite a few meta-analysis, they did find that overall the findings showed that teaching children to manipulate phonemes and words was highly effective under a variety of teaching conditions, with a variety of learners across a range of grade and age levels, and that teaching phonemic awareness to children significantly improves their reading more than instruction that lacks any attention to phonemic awareness. Now, I will also tell you, full transparency, the National Reading Panel found a lot of different strategies to be effective, and it also found some to be ineffective. So, yes, phonemes, graphemes, yes. Based on neuroscience, that's how we establish reading. Is that enough, though, by itself? The research would suggest not. So, right, if we continue phonemes and graphemes in 10th grade, that's probably not the way to continue establish a high-level range of learning. However, if you have a 10th grader with that reading network not established at all, phonemes and graphemes are we have to establish that reading network first. So how is the reading network established before anything else? Yes, neuroscience, phonemes and graphemes. All right, so let's look at the second educational philosophy when it comes to reading, or the second aspect, if you will, on developing a high level of reading. And a lot of this comes from Marilee Spranger's book. It's a great book. I have it linked here, and no, I do not get an affiliate, percentage. So it's just a fascinating book. So one thing I really love about her book and the research that she did, and all the studies that she brought together for her book, is she is one of the few neuroscientists or people that are in neuroscience, that is also an educator. So she has a history of neuroscience for many years, and then she became a teacher. And so she's been also teaching for many years. So in doing all this research, I would see a lot of research from neuroscientists, but that were not classroom educators. Or a lot of research from classroom educators that do not have a background in neuroscience, or even, much information on neuroscience, how the brain learns. Marilee Spranger is someone who has both. And so a lot of this information is from her book. And then it's got links to other studies to support that. So anyway, let's look at that. And so she brings up the behavioral psychology, environmental, and emotional importance. And a lot of this will explain why. So we know that the reading network needs to be established through phonemes and graphemes. But there's more to that, right? I mentioned it takes a village. There's more to that. And this information will explain kind of why students will come into kindergarten with more of a reading network created, if you will, or easier to create that reading network. So let's get into it. So the importance on parents, right? Parents have such a powerful impact on whether a student becomes a great reader, a developed reader, if you will. So her research, her findings suggest that reading ability begins with how much parents communicate with their children and how they communicate with their children. So how much they communicate and how they communicate. And it'll make sense as we go on. I'll explain as we go on. So a child's ability to read is greatly influenced by his or her language development. So it all starts in the household, developing that language. So I have links to 3 studies. And if you click those, I made slides for each of them. So what Spranger says in her book is the brain will allow a person to learn any language and repeat any phoneme. So I mentioned that root of neuroscience, right? Neuroscience, creating that reading network, phonemes, graphemes, creating these sounds, right? The brain can learn any language and any sound and repeat any phonemes if they're introduced to those, or if they're exposed to those sounds. That's why it's so important to speak to the baby in the womb, to speak to the baby in the womb, right after birth, like have the baby hear those sounds of the language. If those phonemes, if those sounds are not used, the brain will prune them away. They'll forget them. So my example, my wife is Filipino. My daughter, so in the Filipino language, they have this sound, this sound. It's this like ng sound that's different than English that I can't pronounce very well. My daughter, who's 6, she pronounces it fine because my wife would speak Tagalog and Visayan, Filipino languages, to my daughter in the womb when my daughter was first born. So my daughter, her brain can reproduce those phonemes, right? She's heard those and she's learned them. So if my daughter does not continue to use that or didn't as she was a young age, the brain would just forget that phoneme, that sound. It just prunes it away. It's very efficient. So in order to read, a child must first learn the sounds of the language. So that's really, really important. So reading to the baby in the womb, exposing those sounds to the baby, having the baby in the womb hear those sounds, that is a very important step for developing a strong reader. So the study that she shows is she talks about responding to babble. So children babbling. And the way mothers respond to that babble is so important, not just mothers, parents. So 2009 study, the Thomas Lamanda Bernstein study, showed that babies whose mothers responded quickly and often to their babble are 6 months ahead when it comes to reading development, between 13 and 18 months. And responding to babble is a crucial component of learning language because babies need an audience. So you're establishing, or parents are establishing, this confidence in these kids that what they say is actually important. And responding to the babble. So when kids are babbling, like positively, like, huh, what are you saying? Like actually responding to that babble, letting the babies know that language development is so important. And the next thing parents can do to really support that development of reading is to read to the baby. Obviously, read to the baby, expose the baby to books and to language and to words. And when children start speaking, so here's the how much and the how. When children start speaking, parents can really support that development of reading by asking questions and responding to what the children say. Building that confidence, like letting the children know that what they're saying is important and language is important, how they respond to language is important. And additionally, holding a child. So when you're reading to a child, holding that child, no matter how old the child is, even if it was a baby, an infant, a newborn, holding that child while reading, creating that positive emotional memory. And so it also stimulates the mirror neurons. So if a baby sees an adult enjoying reading, the baby will just naturally know, like, okay, reading must be fun. But holding that baby while reading is so important for parents to do, because now going on throughout their life, when a child thinks of reading, they have that memory of being held as a kid. It really promotes successful reading or the motivation to keep reading. So the next one, the Hart and Risley study, 1985. So here is the how much aspect. And the researchers went into homes of families of various socioeconomic status and videotaped parents as they interacted with their babies. And the babies were between 7 and 9 months old. So their findings were, by age 3, the children in professional families, this is how they labeled them, this is how they defined them. Professional families, those babies heard more than 30 million words. Working class families, that's how they defined them, heard more than 20 million words. And welfare families on welfare, the babies heard about 10 million words. So exposure to language, to words, is so very, very important. And their study suggested a socioeconomic status has influence over reading development. But they also, in addition, it wasn't how many words. It's what type of words. So there were two separate, how many this amount of words is so important. Speak to your child, get them exposed to these words. but also separate study what type of words were being said. It was that language experience. So they categorize affirmation words, positive words like, hey, you're doing a great job, you're such a hard worker, keep up the good work, we're proud of you, all those things. And then they categorize prohibitory words, like a parent saying, don't do it that way, can't you do anything right, don't do it. So it's the positive and negative, it's affirmation versus prohibitory. And what they noticed was the professional parents offered more affirmative feedback more often. Like, hey, nice job, do this, we got you, we trust you, you're doing great. Yeah, you made a mistake, but hey, now you learn from it. Affirmation, we're so proud of you. And it created a level of confidence for children to not be so frustrated if they didn't get it right away, right? Level of confidence. And they noticed that professional parents used more affirmation words and less prohibitory words than the welfare parents. That's how they categorize. That's what they referred to them as. So welfare parents were more than twice as many. They used twice as many more prohibitory statements, creating almost self-doubt and lack of confidence. And so their conclusions was how often and what type of language is used is very important in language development. And so you think as teachers, let's look at it from our teacher perspective, right? We now are getting these students who we do not know their background. And their individual background, some parents are more positive. They've created more confidence in their child. They have exposed them to language more often. They've started the level of analysis. So when you start asking a child, what do you think about that? What are your feelings there? What does that mean to you? The child is at least starting to get exposed to levels of analysis. Tell me more. And then we have other students in our classroom that have been nothing but negative statements. Stop doing that. Stop talking. So they're not given that confidence of language. They might not be given that confidence of being able to try something. If they don't get it the first time, they want to keep trying until they're successful at it. So we have all these students that have all of this foundation. Not only the reading network might have a lack of reading network created or established, but everything in the early stages of development, all these things that support a developed reading network or a level of reading development, right? Because we know it's not natural. So we have all those students. So as teachers, we got, oh my gosh, we have all these different students with all these different backgrounds, social, emotional, how many words they've been exposed to, what type of words they were exposed to, and of course, the whole fact that they were not born with a reading network in the first place, right? So the takeaway from her research is parents, talk a lot to your kids and speak positively. Speak positively more often, of course. But that brings us to the next thing. So there will be children, there will be students that are great readers that didn't have that emotional support, didn't have the parents speaking to him or her in the womb, didn't have that developmental foundation as a child, but they become amazing readers. And that brings me to the first stage of learning, which is curiosity. Curiosity will supersede really anything. If a person's curious about something, they're going to figure it out. So we have those readers as well, those students. And I think that's so important to understand too. You'll have great readers that will say, I'm a great reader and I didn't have any of those other things that behavioral psychologists will talk about, environmental emotion. I didn't have that, but I was curious. So that's why I did it. So we've got the curiosity factor, the age, an environmental support factor, underdeveloped readers in our class based on social status or the type of words they were exposed to. And there's one more aspect too. So I'm going to use an analogy. I hope it fits. I call it my broccoli analogy. If a student at a young age, a very influential age, important for developing reading comprehension or reading foundation, is constantly told, you need to read, you need to read, you need to do this. Why aren't you reading more? And just told that way like like lectured to, it makes me think of broccoli as a kid, as a 5-year-old, right? You need to eat your vegetables because they're good for you and blah, blah, blah. But now, first of all, vegetables don't really taste well to infants and toddlers, and there's a reason for it, bitterness reason. That way, as adult, people tend to develop more of an interest in vegetables, but as a child, it can be challenging for these bitter vegetables. But if you're now associating like anger to these, you need to eat broccoli, brah, 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 you sit there until you eat it. Now there's this emotional aspect. And if that's being treated as reading, you need to read. Kids will grow up hating vegetables because of how people in their life like shoved it down their throat. Not literally. But students will also reject reading because of the negative experiences they've had by forced reading. And I would say readers read, especially outside, because they enjoy it, right? So it goes back to the question, how do we get our students to enjoy what they're reading? Anyway, so that all being said, that's the behavioral psychology, environmental, and emotional aspect to developing reading. And I think that is so very important to keep in mind when we're trying to, develop and establish these effective readers or develop a foundation in reading for our students. So we looked at the first two aspects of developing an effective reader or a great reader. First, the neuroscience, which is how our brain learns to read. A curriculum based on phonemic awareness is extremely effective. It's very, very clear that will produce the strongest readers or give the best opportunity to, because it's based on how the brain learns to read. And then the behavioral psychology, emotional, and environmental aspect of it, if you have that strong foundation of phonemes and graphemes and phonemic awareness, adding that positive environment, that positive emotional environment, will really just help facilitate creating these strong readers. And of course, we talked about curiosity will supersede everything. But let's look at the third aspect. So the whole word, sight word, balanced literacy, context clues, all that. And so the term reading wars, right? You'll hear that. It's the different philosophies on how best to teach reading. And each will say they have their own scientific evidence. And I talked earlier about being able to evaluate when someone uses that term based on scientific evidence. So the evidence is really clear. Whole words, sight words is not the most effective way to establish a strong reading network. That's not to say it doesn't have its place. Right, so I do have some links here if you want to look at it. Leveled reading theory is not supported by cognitive scientists. Many quote-unquote reading experts, when they found this information out, they kind of denounced whole word, sight word level readers and kind of went with a different, the phonemic awareness philosophy of reading. Whole word, though, has been seen as a good coping mechanism for dyslexia. So it is effective there as far as being able to recognize a word by sight. Visual memories, which is really whole word, sight words, kind of based on visual memories. They are experienced differently in the brain. They are memorized differently in the brain. They don't have that strong connection with the reading network as far as being able to sight and then language, the vision and language network there. So then balanced literacy, right? Balanced literacy came out and said, hey, you've got the whole word, sight word. You've got the neuroscience aspect. Let's just do a little bit. You guys are arguing. Let's do a little bit of both. That's shown to be not as effective as far as curriculum based on phonemic awareness. So I've got a link there as well. So I want to make sure this is clear, though, how I said it takes a village. Although not as efficient, right? These other reading methods, whole words, sight words, balanced literacy, leveled reading, it's not that sometimes they don't have their place, right? If it's done by itself without the inclusion of others, it's not going to be as effective at all, of course. But that's not to say that these philosophies of reading don't have a place somewhere, right? Because we have to keep in mind that we are not born to naturally read. So yes, based on neuroscience, phonemic awareness, phonemes, graphemes, that's how we establish a strong foundation of reading networks. That's how we establish our reading network. But especially in high school, when students use context, right? Like that, being able to read, not knowing a word, trying to figure out context, right? That's a very good skill to have. So again, even though the evidence is clear, that curriculum based on phonemic awareness is very effective, much more effective in establishing and creating, developing strong readers, based on a good reading network. It's not to say whole words, sight words, balanced literacy don't have their place at times. So just to clarify that. So it's a realistic way of teaching. You're like, Matt, great. All this information, cool. I think I got it. For those of you who are still with me, thank you. What's realistic for us, right? Because, realistically, if we're in a class of 36 students and 3 students can't read at all, we can't really stop our class and say, sorry guys, we need some phonemic awareness or some phoneme lessons, like starting very beginning. We're talking beginning level reading. We can't do that for 6 weeks while we're trying to catch our other students up. We can't. Though pulling students out of class to do a class on phonemic awareness, that would be good. That'd be really effective. But what's a realistic way of teaching? So I made reference to this before, and I'm going to show you guys this. So the National Reading Panel of the year 2000 report, and I mentioned there's not an updated report. They looked at effective teaching strategies based on meta-analysis. Now, what their findings were, phonemic awareness, where's their top finding? Meta-analysis were impressive. You can read that there. I won't read it to you, mainly for sake of time, right? But their conclusion, phonemic awareness, extremely effective. Phonics instruction, extremely effective. Vocabulary instruction, reviews that vocabulary instruction does lead to gains in comprehension. Okay, that would make sense, right? But those methods must be appropriate to the age and ability of the reader. As I mentioned, the example of if you're in 10th grade and someone doesn't read at all, right? Basic levels of phonemic awareness is not going to be effective for the other readers. And we've got in our class, we have a wide range of readers. Guided oral reading. So, guided oral reading had a significant and positive impact on word recognition, fluency, and comprehension across a range of grade levels. But the panel could find no multi-year studies providing information on the relationship between guided oral reading and the emergence of fluency. So, as we're reading along and we're helping our students read, it's good for fluency. It's good for pronunciation. It can be effective as a pronunciation. Independent silent reading. People have asked me, what do I think of independent silent reading? I'm a big believer in not teaching reading, not doing reading out of context, or not doing reading in isolation unless you're pleasure reading, right? Not just reading just for the purpose of reading, especially in education. Again, unless you're pleasure reading, reading at home on your own for your enjoyment, because that's the purpose, right? But if you just have it shoving a book in someone's hand and saying read for 15 minutes, it won't be as effective. And the studies supported that. Having students engage in independent silent reading with minimal guidance or feedback, the panel was unable to find a positive relationship between programs and instructions that encourage large amounts of independent reading. So the thing is, if our students read more, great. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But that's not necessarily the case. If they're just reading just for reading without pleasure, without purpose, without any guidance, and they're just sitting there for 15 minutes trying to read, it's not as impactful. Test comprehension instruction, which is essentially intentional thinking during the medium constructed through interactions between text and readers. Essentially, in general, the evidence suggests that teaching a combination of reading comprehension techniques is the most effective. Questions remain as to which strategies are most effective for which age groups. And they list 7 different strategies there. You can click the link to find that yourself. Teacher instruction PD workshops they found showed positive effects. Yay! So I'll keep doing these videos. But there are too few long-term studies available. So now, to be fair, this was done in 2000. We know, and I know just by doing these workshops, knowledge in isolation is not going to be effective. No matter what you learn from a workshop, if you don't apply it in your classroom in a way that's successful, right? There's many different ways you could apply something in your classroom and it not work because you didn't do it successfully. But apply it successfully, root what you're trying to teach in things that students have done before so it's easier for them to remember, et cetera, et cetera. Those can be effective. Workshops where you just learn some stuff and you can't apply it to the classroom, those aren't as effective. And this is interesting. So this was 2000, where technology wasn't necessarily used a lot in classroom yet. computer technology and reading instruction. The studies were positive, suggesting it's possible to use computer technology for reading instruction, but it was too outdated. That's what I started, but too outdated. Let's look at some recent test scores. So anyway, their findings: phonemic awareness, phonics instruction, vocabulary instruction, very effective. Guided oral reading, okay. Independent silent reading, Test comprehension, we need a bunch of strategies. So you can read the whole report if you really want to. I've linked it there. So the way I'm looking at this then is, as I mentioned, it takes a village. So I really like this picture that I put on the screen. Feel free to look at it if you'd like. So there's the phonemic awareness leads to whole word recognition, leads to full comprehension. Now, I don't necessarily buy into the whole word recognition part, but I do like, the reason I like this graphic is because it shows like one can lead to the next, can lead to the next. So what I would like is if there was something that had behavioral psychology in here. So phonemic awareness. Establish a strong foundation of reading using phonemic awareness, a curriculum based on phonemic awareness. The whole word, sight word, the context clues are great ways to supplement, especially the context clues, those type of strategies, if that phonemic awareness is established. And of course, having that strong emotional and environmental support goes a long way with establishing a strong reading environment. And then hopefully that will lead to full comprehension. So let's look at reading scores and reading levels and how they become established. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about Lexile scores and how Lexile levels were developed and established because I did a whole video on that. So it's linked right here, Lexile Explained. I think it's a fascinating video answering every question you've ever wanted to know about Lexile, and you could teach a seminar about Lexile after watching that video. I contacted Lexile employees. I talked to Lexile employees and got, everything you want to know about Lexile. So I won't talk too much about that just for sake of time, but let's look at reading scores. So we know we're trying, as teachers, we're trying so hard to raise our reading scores. And we know that reading is so difficult. We now know why, and so on. The difficulty, why it's to develop proficient readers, if you will. So let's look at the reading scores. This is from 1992 to 2019. And if you look, like people have been saying, like, wow, our reading scores have plummeted, recently or plummeted for so long, et cetera, et cetera. Let's just look at the scores. Now, I do understand. I want to make sure I clarify. The NAEP, I do understand that not all schools participate. I do understand that it's a sample size, albeit it's a very large sample size, but I get that it's not everybody. So, the data will only tell a little bit of the story, right? So I get that. Let's just acknowledge that. So if you look at reading scores, though, 1992, 292, and there really hasn't been peaks and valleys, right? Which is consistent with how I talked about how throughout generations, people have been like, we need to establish more proficient readers. And if something is consistent, there's got to be a reason for it, right? And so if you look at this, the reading scores have been very consistent all throughout. And it's literally like, have they plummeted recently? No, it's only 2 points lower than 1994. And peaked down, so 1 point lower than 2005. Now, I talk about like you could take data. Anyone can take data and interpret it any way they'd like. So if you could look at it this way. You could say, look, Matt, the test scores are the lowest that they've been in, what would that be, 30 years? It's the lowest it's been in 30 years. You're not wrong, but only by a point, right? So watch out for the headline type things, only by a point. So that's for seniors. Let's look at 8th graders. And there should be, same level of consistency. It's actually higher, than in 1992, right? Like, no, students aren't reading as much. Their test scores are plummeting. They're actually raising 3 points since 1992. But anyway, I'm joking aside there to show that, there's a consistency to our reading levels. And we know why now, right? So let's look at 4th graders. Okay, consistency throughout, even higher than from 1980s. But you can see it's a very consistent test scores. So what do test scores tell us about reading? Sorry, I paused because I had to flip through my slides. You know, you can just kind of interpret it the way you want to, the way what you're trying. So you could say like, "Hey, look, we're way below proficient," but then we start. It lends itself to question, where are these levels coming from? Proficiency. Um, um, I'm pulling the NAEP back up. So advanced, proficient, basic. Like, who comes up with these levels? I have the answer for you. So let's get into a few things before getting to that. Sorry, I keep flipping the slides. All right. So regarding Lexile, I will say this. Reading levels and reading scores are not always a fair and accurate measure of. And then I put of what? Intelligence, ability. So, highly intelligent people, maybe they just don't like to read. They haven't established a great reading network, but they can analyze very, very well. And so you start questioning, what are these reading scores telling us? Well, obviously they're telling us that our readers aren't proficient. But where did that proficiency come from? And like I said, I'm going to explain too. So here's my video on Lexile Explained. I did want to mention this. For those who saw that video, I did not put this in the video, mainly because I didn't see it at the time. But Lexile scores can be manipulated. Lexile levels can be manipulated. So as you know, if you saw my video, you know that the Lexile levels are based on 3 million tests given over a certain amount of time. And Lexile took those 3 million tests and took the middle 50% scores. And they said that's ninth grade level. So let's say there were 3 million ninth graders that took this test. And then they chopped off the middle. They took the middle 50%. And if you look at the ninth grade reading level, 1050 to 1360, that's the middle 50% scores. And so they said that's the level, the reading level. However, with this little scale right here, if you want, you can take down to the bottom 10%. And now all of a sudden the ninth grade level goes to 900 to 1360, or you can take the top 10% of all scores, and which were 1520 and above. So when people say ninth grade level, they're actually talking about the 50% that's in the middle, not of all ninth graders, because you can adjust this and manipulate it however you'd like. So you can technically argue that a more accurate ninth grade level is 900 to 1520, if you wanted to, right? If that was important to you. Anyway, I just wanted to point that out. So sorry, I keep messing this up. How are these levels created? These reading levels, and so let me show this to you. This article explains how this is from this is NAEP. This is how the government establishes reading levels. And so what they do is they essentially take, I'll put it here, the standard setting involves approximately 20 to 30 content experts, typically teachers and other subject matter experts, meeting for several days and receiving in-depth training. So you have to question who's training them, like what's the training based on? If they're supposed to be the ones setting the reading levels, who's training them? And, panelists also recommend exemplars, like they'll take like great examples of great readers and use them as suggestions. But the reading levels are essentially judgment-based. Here, this is from their website. The NAEP achievement levels are based on collective judgments of broadly representative panel of teachers, education specialists, and members of the general public. So where do we get the proficient, advanced, basic reading levels? Kind of a judgment call. We get them from a panel of experts. Now, the question then becomes, what are they an expert in? Like experts in what, right? Because we know that reading is not something that we're born with, right? It has to be established. So are you asking a panel of neuroscientists who understand how this reading network's developed? Asking a panel of teachers, which you could argue, and I say this respectfully because I'm an educator, we don't always know how the brain learns, right? We're learning, right? Neuroeducation is kind of a new thing. Education specialists, again, what aspects of education are they specializing in? Maybe not how the brain learns. And members of the general public. Those members, who are they? What are they experts in? Why are they in charge of setting these levels? So one could ask or say maybe these levels are based on results that are desired, like desired results, versus what is generally obtained. So we know that 54% of all adults read at a 6th grade level and below. And we know those levels are developed by panels of teachers, people that are experts in their field. That doesn't necessarily mean experts in the analysis of how reading is developed, and the general public. So maybe the reading levels, we don't look at the data of what's established. Reading levels are pretty consistent across the board. Most adults read at a 6th grade reading level and below. But we're basing those levels, and I mean we, I don't mean us, you and I mean the people who are creating those levels. Maybe they're basing the levels on the results they desire, what they want to see, rather than or as opposed to what can actually happen. Just throwing that out there, and I think it's a very fair and valid thing to question about these reading levels. Because at least now you know how they're established. So when you look at that, like, advanced reading, proficient reading, you now know that those levels are created by people of the general public, and others that are could be a panel of teachers and experts in their field, though we don't know what field. I do want to show you this. So the Program for International Student Assessment, this is the PISA, they do the world rankings there. Those tests are based on 15-year-olds. So when we're like, hey, U.S. is 32nd in the world in reading, like we're kind of relying on brains of 15-year-olds to, establish world rankings for reading levels, right? Oftentimes 15-year-olds aren't thinking about how important it is to establish effective reading levels so that they can represent our country in the world rankings. They're oftentimes thinking of other things in life. So again, I'm just sharing the information with you, keeping in mind too that reading levels don't take into account for a second read. So if you are reading something that you're unfamiliar with and you read it, let's say you take a test on it, your reading level is going to be lower. But let's say you do a second read after being exposed to the vocab, your reading level is going to be a lot higher. So it also doesn't take into account for motivation. It doesn't take into account age as well. Though you could say, well, age, of course, the different grade levels. I get it, but there's a lot of other factors, vocab knowledge, brain development, motivation, in addition to a second read that doesn't take that into account. So maybe if you did a Lexile test one thing, and then you taught all that vocab, and then took the Lexile test again, you would presumably score much higher. Here is a link to a Washington Post article, 2019, that questions the PISA ranking and the reading scores. And there's one more thing I wanted to show you that I thought was very, very important. So one more thing I want to point out regarding reading levels, and then we'll move on, is that according to the NAEP, this is on their website, we know that reading levels are established by a group of general public, educators, and people that are experts in their field. Again, we don't know necessarily if they're experts in neuroscience, which is how reading, they can explain how reading is developed in the brain. But it does say, so the NAEP does evaluate whether the reading levels are fair, and it says here, the evaluation concluded, this is from 2016 when they did the evaluation, that further evidence should be gathered to determine whether the NAEP achievement levels are reasonable, valid, and informative. So I just wanted to point out, even there, they're kind of questioning their own, whether their reading levels are valid. And the reason I point all this out is we have to remember, as teachers are being judged by this. Students are being judged by this. Teachers are are feeling can feel bad if their students aren't reading at grade level. And then we realize that these reading levels are maybe not established, not maybe not, they're not established in science, right? They're not rooted in science. And they're constantly evaluated to see whether they're fair or not. And the conclusion is they need to keep being evaluated. So I just want to point that out. So as we're coming to the end of this video, I want to talk about a few false philosophies for reading development that are kind of out there. And this is, throughout the research, I come across this, and they aren't supported by neuroscience and behavioral psychology. It's just something that English teachers specifically sometimes think about, like, hey, why don't we need to just do this, or our students just need to do that, and if they do that, they're going to be better readers. It isn't necessarily supported by science. I just want to talk about the four, what I would say, most common ones. The first one is the just read more philosophy. It's the idea of, hey, if our students would just read more, they're going to be better. And that isn't necessarily the case, because if they don't have that strong neural network, that reading network created, it can lead to frustration. And, if someone's really frustrated, they're just not going to do it. The students still need those proper supports. And it's just like, no matter what, if someone doesn't do something properly, repeating those same steps isn't going to make them any better, right? They need that support. And most importantly, they need the enjoyment of reading. They need the curiosity. They need the motivation, right, to get better at something. Enjoyment with achievement, right? If someone enjoys what they're doing and they're getting better at it, they're more apt to continue doing it. So the second what I would call false philosophy is the just try harder. Our students just need to try harder. They need to just put more effort into it, which, just like the first one, can lead to frustration if they're not, if they don't have the proper instruction, the proper support. And honestly, if they just don't enjoy what they're doing, it's not going to make them want to get better. They have the curiosity, they need to spark that motivation, they need to enjoy what they're doing when it comes to reading. So the third thing is the do what great readers do, right? This came out a few years ago and it was really pushed. We need to show our students what great readers do. Therefore, they can become great readers. And the issue with that is great. So great readers, right? All of those things that great readers do can be identified after successful reading occurs, right? Once a person is a successful reader, then they can reflect back to see what they can do. So if someone is a successful reader, has a strong reading network, is a great reader, they have the ability to analyze characters. They have the ability to, interpret and inference, like what's going to happen, predict what's going to happen. They have the ability to do that, context clues, all that stuff. But they have that ability. So they've gotten this ability of being a successful reader, so they can do all of those things. Now that they're successful readers, they have the ability to do all those. They didn't build the ability of being successful readers by doing those things in the first place. And so it's almost like a reverse, like working your way backwards, you could say. And so to do what great readers do, it really is, readers read because they enjoy it. Right? So that's the big thing. The really thing, we want our students to enjoy what they're reading, right? Good readers, as they're developing and becoming good readers, they don't necessarily reflect on how they read. Like, hey, I'm going to go ahead and read today, and then start analyzing these characters and doing all these things and annotate in my head mentally. I'm going to do all this stuff to become a successful reader. No, it's usually backwards. Successful readers can do those things. So to create successful readers, we want our students to enjoy what they're reading, get motivated to read more, curiosity, right? Find what they're interested in and pursue that and support that, and give them the proper tools to be able to develop that reading network. Finally, the last thing is Lexile. Lexile equals rigor. So the thing is, rigor can be increased based on what is done with the text, not necessarily the text itself. And I'll give you an example. So Night, which is taught in 10th grade, is a 3rd grade reading level. So the Lexile's very low, right? 3rd grade reading level. But I would definitely not teach that in 3rd grade, right? You can have a great rigorous unit based on Night, even though it's a 3rd grade reading level. So Lexile equals rigor is not always necessarily the case. Okay, so as we're coming to the end, what can we do as teachers? The first thing is be understanding of how difficult it is to read. If you sat through this entire video, thank you so much for doing so. By now, you understand it is so difficult to read, to learn how to read, and you know why it is. That's the key. You know why. That neural network has to be established first. And if someone has a difficult time reading, that neural network isn't established as strongly as it could be. So we know why it's difficult to read. Don't react negatively when it comes to reading. So our individual students, if you have 36 students in class, each student has their own neural network developed, right? Their own level of network. And so getting frustrated with a student who doesn't have something that's created that really they have very little control in creating, right? Unless they're curious, unless they're motivated, unless they're inspired, right? They can't just magically create this neural network, right? They have to work on it, but the easiest way to work on it is something that it inspires them, they enjoy. When someone reacts negatively about that, they're not gonna be motivated to read. They're gonna have that they're gonna think, when they think of reading, they'll think, oh my gosh, negative, I'm not good at it. Teachers always yell at me. I feel so bad about myself. That's not gonna encourage them to continue to create that reading pathway. So don't act negatively when it comes to reading. Like support any growth, praise any growth. The next one, communicate with your students. All right, so we know that the reading network is based on a strong language foundation. So it starts with the vision and the language network. So we need to communicate with our students a lot, talk to them a lot. Have them talk back to you, respond, get them curious, get them analyzing verbally, right? And then it can translate to analyzing within reading, right? Have them analyze, through quick writes, informative quick writes, and get them talking, get them thinking. Next, focus on how the brain learns, right? Phonemic awareness, phonemes, graphemes. If it were, ideally it'd be great if schools could do pullouts for phoneme and grapheme development, right? Phoneme awareness development. So if let's say you have a group of 10th graders and 3 or 4 10th graders have a very low level of reading network that's been established, it'd be great if they could be pulled out and be given lessons on phonemes and graphemes separately, right? So they can start building their reading level up. When a challenging word comes up, have everyone speak through it, right? If there's a word you've never seen before or your students have never seen before, do it together, right? Let's just speak through it together, have them repeat it with you together, not for 10 minutes, right? Don't focus on it so much, but you're reading together and you're like, dude, that's a weird word. Let's do it. Let's speak it out together, blah, blah, blah. And you speak it out together. Have them start developing those together as a class. And so importantly, spark interest in everything that you do. Look at my video. I've got the video of great ways to be in class. Look at that. Watch that. My workshop on how the brain learns and talking about sparking interest with effective quick writes. Please watch that one. If they're interested, if they're curious, that's the first stage of successful learning. Next one, don't stress or think that it's your fault if the students have difficulty reading, because you can't control what they came into your classroom with, right? If you've seen this whole video, and if you're sticking with me, hopefully you haven't fast forwarded anything, you know that especially middle school and high school teachers and elementary school teachers, you can only, like your students came to you with a level of reading network established. Some not so much, some maybe a high level, depending on what the parents did to support that when they were young, the children were young, or depending on the curiosity factor of the student, right? Some students, some children with no strong foundation by their parents for successful readers become great readers because they're just curious, right? They want to figure it out themselves. So if your students are at a low level of reading, especially beginning of the year, dude, it is not on you, right? It is, and it may not even be on the previous teachers, right? It's before how that foundation has been established. So if in the middle of the year, your students are still at a low reading level, don't stress or think it's your fault. If you see some growth, right? We do our best. If there's any growth, praise that growth. Don't put all the pressure on you I mean, oh my gosh, you've got to teach 36 different students per class, each with different reading levels. So, step back, go, all right, I got my work cut out for me, but don't feel like you're making students worse readers, because reading is not something we naturally do in the first place, right? We try to do as best we can. We try to establish and create these great readers. And at the end of the day, if you see growth, praise that growth, right? Be like, dude, you went from, if you do the Lexile scores at the beginning of the year, you went from a 600 to an 800. That's amazing, because now it's the next teacher's turn, right, at the end of the year to start building that. So praise any growth. Know as teachers you're doing the best you can. And so final couple slides here, and then I'll bring this to a close. So here's I call it under my findings. The whole video is pretty much the findings I found, but this is kind of the final things I wanted to point out. And a lot of this is just personal commentary, so take this for what you will. But I found that really it is very difficult to balance effective strategies for something that isn't natural for a person to do. So when people say, what's the most effective reading strategy? You've got 36 different students, and for each one, something will be very effective. And understanding that reading is not natural for us to do, so it's difficult to find like that one, strategy that always works all the time for something that is really foreign to our brain. So as long as we're using a mix of great strategies, as long as we have a foundation of phonemic awareness, you're on the right track, right? As long as you're inspiring students to want to read, that's cool. You're on the right track with that. And also when we talk about reading levels, knowing that if you watch my Lexile Explain video, knowing how Lexile levels are created, and knowing that reading isn't natural, and so there is not a real grade level. Like there's definitely we can create a level of reading, but that doesn't equate to a grade level. Even Lexile will explain that. Watch my videos. When I talk to Lexile employees, they will say that, and it's on their website. So to say that something is an accurate grade level is not valid or correct at all, because there isn't such a thing. Again, watch my Lexile Explain video. So, and we know how the NAEP creates their reading proficiency levels. Maybe society's basing our reading levels on expectations or desired results versus more realistic ability to develop reading. You looked at, 54% of all people read at a 6th grade level or below. So we have to kind of question and wonder, the way are these not level of reading, but reading levels based on grades, how accurate are they? Are they based on more desired results versus actual, I don't want to say actual ability, because obviously we can see there's amazing readers and it's something that can definitely be developed. But it does start to wonder, like, just knowing that the reading levels aren't necessary. There's nothing that can be accurately created based on something that is unnatural for us. And so we know a strong foundation in phonemes and graphemes has to be established before anything else can be successful. We know that for sure. And realistically, it's a combination of all three areas of reading perspectives need to be applied. Neuroscience, behavioral psychology, emotional, environmental, and what I would consider the other, right? So like contextual clues, sight words, whole words, like a combination of strategies once a foundation is created, will really help there. So the NAEP reading scores, I've already shown you these, so I don't think I have to go over these again. And then I do want to show you, though, the PISA results, reading results throughout the year. So people, you'll hear these things in the paper, and you'll see it on the news. You'll see things cited like, our reading levels are dropping, across the board, and in the world we rank this, and we're so far behind, and we've gotten so far, all this stuff. So if you look at the last 23 years of scores, 2022 is expected to come out late 2023. The levels have been consistent, right? Even 2018, they were really the same as they have been in 2000. So it's not like a huge drop and then a huge spike, and that's just it's consistent, right? Reading levels are consistent. So I just want to point that out there. And then finally, my final thoughts, and then we have one more thing, and then we'll close this out. My final thoughts. If people really understood how difficult learning to read is, I think we would revisit how we evaluate reading. Um, there's this term, sometimes you'll hear like reading failure, and I think the fact that we can read just shows how incredible our brain is. The fact we can read at all shows how incredible our brain is. And oftentimes you'll hear support on like, hey, this strategy works because this part of the brain, this and this. And it really is just the fact that our brain can adapt to create something that wasn't there naturally. I think is incredible. So reading failure, dude, we couldn't read in the first place. So it's pretty amazing that we can read it all, and that that many people are successful, right, at reading. The next one, so we are trying to control something that's so difficult to develop and has too many determining factors of success. So to find like the one right way to read, I think is just very challenging to do, because there's so many determining factors of success. Some people are great readers because from birth their parents facilitated that and supported that and then created that love of reading. And then others, they didn't have that support, yet they still have this amazing love of reading. And then others, they have the support, but they just don't care. They don't have an enjoyment of reading. So maybe their reading levels aren't as high as other students. So there's so many determining factors of success. And then as teachers, we're judged by how our students' reading scores are, and without having all the information behind it. So, when it comes to reading, it's a finish line. Sorry, I said that wrong. There's not a finish line. Don't quote me on that. There's not a finish line when it comes to reading. It's a journey, right? So be positive with any growth, right? It's definitely a journey. And middle and high school teachers, by the time they get to us, especially if you're 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th grade, it can be more limited as how impactful we can have when it comes to reading instruction. What I mean by that is a lot of our instruction in high school is not based on phonemic awareness. A lot of the stuff is kind of just based on, students read and answer questions, and it takes the teacher to inspire, right? So our biggest impact as a teacher is to inspire great reading. Like, we may not take a person who's a 200 reading level and make them a 1400 reading level and then at the end of a year. So our greatest skill or power, if you will, is that we can inspire, right? Make learning fun, make reading fun. Elementary school teachers, like, seriously, you are doing the greatest job, right? Because you're basically sculpting these students, reading network. And parents, holy cow, if you would just know how important and impactful those first 5 years are when it comes to reading, you would make our jobs as teachers so much easier. So phonemes and graphemes are based on how the brain learns. Other strategies aren't harming students, but maybe not as effective as a whole. And I already kind of gave this analogy already, so I'll skip that. I gave that one too. So, in looking at the history of how difficult reading can be, we just have to go back historically. If something is historically consistent, then there's definitely a reason for it. And so, final thing before I get into some other random research in this video, like, who has the magic formula? I mentioned this. I don't know if anyone has the magic formula. Reading's not natural, and not all teaching strategies take into account individual needs. I think we're doing a decent job. Or we're trying to, right? I think so. Just educators around the world. There's no magic formula to reading, other than maybe the students individually, curiosity, right? If someone loves to do something, they're going to find a way to be successful at it. So if you're under my this is my last slide. Thank you so much for sitting through this. This is miscellaneous info that I researched and found out about reading that I didn't really have a place to put. This is just kind of the fun little like random trivia. So we do have, if you ever notice, kids will flip the letters B, P, and D. We have this part of our brain that we're born with that allows us to essentially, it's like this, we get to mirror images. So if we see a person's side of the face, we recognize who that person is because we mirror the side of their face and see their face as a whole. And so we do that with letters as kids. So if you ever have like a kid and you're teaching, B, P, and D, and they flip it, like if they write B but they write D instead, or P or Q or something, they flip them. Totally normal, usually goes away by about 9 years old. It's just our brain having to unlearn something that we're born being able to do as far as the mirror image thing goes. New research is suggesting that there's ways to teach math that follows an innate mathematical ability. I don't know a lot about it, but I did see that as I came across reading. There's this new math research that's coming up. I'll start looking into a little more. There's a lot of videos about for kids, like little babies, like teach them to read by, shoving this DVD in or have the kid watch these videos. It's actually harmful for babies' reading abilities because infants need to see lips. Infants learn how to read lips, right? So one of the things, and we know from when the COVID lockdown happened, of course, when we're all speaking behind masks, it can be difficult understanding what someone is saying. Not that we can't hear them, but we're not able to read their lips. Lip reading is a very valuable part of learning speech. So the research is suggesting not to shove a video in or play a video for your infant showing like words and letters and hoping that they're going to learn to read that way, because babies need to see lip reading. So reading experts who quote unquote are saying they're reading experts tend to be experts in the pedagogy of reading, not necessarily how the brain learns to read. And as teachers, we're not always taught the science behind how the brain learns to read. I did read that boys tend to be 1.5 years behind in reading, generally a chromosome issue or chromosome reason. Memory development impacts reading ability. I talked about that a little bit. And finally, I want to show this last thing, and this will be the last one there. Why English is very difficult to learn. This is more for our ELs, but honestly for anyone as well who's kind of learning that language, is our grammatical and spelling rules are not consistent. We use excessive uses of idiomatic expressions. We definitely have a lot of different dialects, and we speak really quickly, myself included. We tend to write differently than we speak. So like if someone's an EL and learning, language for the first time, so even all of our students, right? We will speak one thing, students can tell us something, but when we ask them to write it, they freeze up. They're like, I don't know how to write it, because we have like 2 different languages. We don't write the same way we speak, and that can be confusing for students. If you look at our language background, English is 26% Germanic, 30% French, 30% Latin. And for those mathematicians are going, dude, your math is off. We're like, what is that, 14% everything else? Let me do the math. Yes, 14% other stuff, right? There's the others. We do make up words a lot every generation, so that's one of the reasons why English is very difficult to learn. And I clicked here a link to an article that said that English is the weirdest language. So keeping in mind, our students are trying to learn to read, and our language is not consistent. So, a background with phonemic awareness, yet our words aren't always following those rules as well. Anyway, thank you guys so much for sitting through this and listening to me talk about reading. And that's what I got. Thanks again.